can hurt sometimes, but it's the only thing that I know. When it gets hard, you know it can get hard sometimes. It is the only thing that makes us feel alive.
Hello? Okay. All right, I think we can slowly get started. Maybe a few more people will straggle in, but we'll get started. We don't want to keep Joseph here all night. Okay, so I'd like to, on behalf of the LAS department and the LAS conference committee, and as the new chair of the committee, my name is Alexander Schwartz. And on behalf of our departed Jeff, who died very suddenly in the beginning of this year, we'd like to honor him at this year's conference. So today we will be, this is, I believe, our 8th annual LAS conference. And today we're going to hear from Joseph Heath, who'll be talking about Enlightenment 2.0, what's old is new again. So before I pass on the mic to my colleague and fellow LAS conference committee member, Jonathan Salem-Wiseman, to introduce our incredible keynote speaker, I wanted to share a few thoughts, and also you did receive a nice swag gift this time, so it's not a pen, it's not paper, it's his actual book. So before he goes into his extremely enlightening book, which I believe is critical reading for the state of the world that we currently find ourselves inhabiting, I wanted to start off by paraphrasing from the last paragraph in his book. There's been a huge resurgence in Isaac Asimov's foundation novels among American liberals, because these books speak to the question that has been troubling many. What is the responsibility of intellectuals faced with a civilization in irreversible decline that has no interest in listening to intellectuals? Asimov's answer, unfortunately, is to secede from society, let everything collapse, then spend the next 1,000 years putting things back together. And I would agree with Joseph Heath that we, friends and allies of the Enlightenment, especially everyone who is registered for this conference, will be able to do better than that by bringing reason and rationality back to our discourse to create a better world that we can all be proud of. As I was reading Heath's book, I came across an interesting opinion article by one of my favorite journalists, Fareed Zakaria, in the Washington Post, entitled, "I wanted to understand Europe's populism, so I talked to Bono." And I think it offers some great insights to ponder while we listen to Heath's keynote address and attend all the panels at our conference. Europe and America is ablaze with populism being peddled by nationalists and extremists, and these forces have taken control in Hungary, Poland, Italy, and the United States. And they are steadily gaining ground elsewhere, in countries like Germany and Sweden. And it seems that everywhere, the fuel is the same: hostility towards strangers, foreigners, anyone who is different. A Hungarian sociologist, Andrei Sik, who had polled Hungarians about allowing asylum seekers into the country, found strong resistance to accepting particular groups such as Romanians, Chinese, and Arabs, and Parisians. And who are Parisians? He made it up. Because Hungarian xenophobia is based on the belief that these groups are different, we don't know them, and therefore we hate them. In Francis Fukuyama's new book, Identity, the Demand for Dignity and the Politics of Resentment, he argues that identity stems from humans' deep-seated psychological need to be recognized as possessing dignity. And in recent decades, in the search for recognition, persecuted minorities have celebrated their identity, and so have working-class whites, who now feel ignored and forgotten. Fukuyama believes that the answer is not to reject identity politics, but to construct broad identities that can embrace others and unify different groups. The founders of the EU, he argues, spent too much time building the technical aspects of the project, laws, rules, tariffs, and neglected to nurture an actual European identity, something people could believe in, not for rational reasons, but for emotional and idealistic ones. And in the American case, he argues, the anti-populist forces love to create a broad identity centered on core American ideas and values with a much greater focus on assimilation rather than narrow ethnic or religious ones. So we need to connect with people in their guts, not just in their heads, which I'm sure Heath will talk about today. Bono argues, and Zakaria agrees, that the real European and American project should be about taking back the word patriotism that has been stolen from us by nationalists and extremists, who demand uniformity because real patriots seek unity above homogeneity, and what people in Europe, the United States, ought to be proud of, what they should celebrate, are the remarkable achievements of diversity, and still leave room for what Winston Churchill called an enlarged patriotism, plural allegiances, layered identities, to be Irish and European, not either or. So I know you didn't come here to listen to me, so I'll stop there and turn the mic over to Jonathan Salem-Wiseman to introduce our guest speaker, Joseph Heath. At the end of Joseph Heath's talk, we will have a Q&A, followed by some announcements about the conference, and a reception with some great food so that we can feed our stomachs after Professor Heath has fed our minds.
Good afternoon. This spring, when Alex was soliciting his colleagues for possible themes and speakers for this year's conference, I just happened to be reading Professor Heath's Enlightenment 2.0, and so I thought, wow, here is someone whose work is broadly interdisciplinary, who is able to translate difficult theoretical arguments into clear, accessible prose, and who is writing about issues that seem perhaps even more urgent now in the age of Trump and truthiness than when this book was published in 2014. Plus, I figured he'd be a way better bargain than Steven Pinker. So I shot off an email to Alex, and thanks to his incredible hard work over the last several months, here we are. Professor Heath began his undergraduate work at McGill, and this was, according to certain well-placed sources who knew him at the time, his anarchist phase. A philosopher friend of mine who knew Joe back then said, "Yep, long hair, black army boots, trench coat, the whole 9 yards." I'm just glad to see that he has cleaned up a bit since then. He then went to Northwestern to complete his MA and his PhD, where he studied critical thinking, at least the good kind, with people like Tom McCarthy and someone called Jürgen Habermas. He is currently professor of philosophy at the University of Toronto, specializing in ethics and social and political philosophy. Enlightenment 2.0 is the most recent of 7 or maybe 8 books that Professor Heath has published. The Biblioblitz commenced in 2001 when The Efficient Society appeared, followed by Communicative Action and Rational Choice in 2003, and The Rebel Cell, which he co-authored with Andrew Potter, who gave a very nice talk here about 7 or 8 years ago, in 2005. My personal favorite, though, is Filthy Lucre, which is a book written by a philosopher that actually deals with economics. It critically examines a number of economic dogmas and myths held by both the political left and the political right. Virtually no one is unskewered in this work. In 2013, Professor Heath was inducted into the Royal Society of Canada, and the following year, Enlightenment 2.0 won the Shaughnessy Cohen Prize for political writing. It was, I'm sure, very sweet for Professor Heath to defeat Naomi Klein in this category. When we read Professor Heath's work, we are treated to all kinds of insights about rational choice theory, cognitive biases, collective action problems, business ethics, markets, and the philosophy of language. I could go on. But we also get to learn a few things about the author's personal life. I, for one, as someone who was called Jonathan Wiseass and Jonathan Dumbwoman, that's very clever, am deeply jealous of Professor Heath's childhood nickname, Spock. I was also surprised to learn that a once trenchcoat-wearing anarchist now drives a lawn tractor. When I came across that biographical detail, strange Venn diagrams began to spontaneously appear in my mind's eye. Over here, the set of all professional philosophers. Over here, the set of all erstwhile anarchists. And over here, the lawn tractor drivers. I suspect that there is only one member who belongs to all 3 groups, and that member is possibly Vulcan. Friends and colleagues, it is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Joseph Heath.
Thank you for those fabulous introductions. Here, I have a timer so I don't speak for too long. Something we should all invest in. Okay, well, so thank you so much for inviting me, Alex, and thanks for all coming here on a Friday when you could be doing other things. Thanks also for the fabulous swag, buying all the books. Those of you, many of you will know, it's really hard to sell books. So, like, nothing warms an author's heart like a big stack of them being given away, which I assume someone paid for. Anyhow, so this book, yes. So here I am, the poor man, Steven Pinker. This book was actually written before Trump got elected. And so I'd love to be able to say, like, oh, I was so prescient and so forth. I mean, in a sense, what I was concerned about with the, anti-rationalism in politics, it was actually the Harper government that was getting me all exercised. Now, post-Trump, you look back at that, and I'm kind of like, yeah, like, talk about a Vulcan, right? Like, what was I so worried about? So some of the concerns that I had at the time in 2014 sort of pale in comparison. So while it would be tempting to give a kind of update on the thesis of the book for the age of Trump or whatever, I've been trying to sell my publisher on, like, the new Trump edition of Enlightenment 2.0. But I actually thought I would resist that, and actually I wanted to talk more generally about the sort of resurgence of the Enlightenment, and in keeping with the theme of the conference, like how those of us who work in the humanities and the liberal arts should be thinking about the way in which the Enlightenment is making something of a comeback. And so we often use the metaphor of a pendulum to describe the way opinion shifts within the academy. So certain ideas are super popular, and then people react against it and got to go too far. So certainly that's the case with the notion of enlightenment. So when I was in grad school, the Enlightenment, like nobody would walk into a room and say, I'm an Enlightenment intellectual or whatever. The Enlightenment was seen entirely as a term of abuse. And that's because the Enlightenment was seen, and by this I'm talking about the sort of 17th, 18th century high European Enlightenment, Voltaire and so. I mean, it was basically seen as a kind of false universalism. Namely, that a bunch of European Christians, had sat around. Well, there was Spinoza too, but whatever. So there's a bunch of European intellectuals got around and decided that they were going to declare, the rule of reason over tradition and the passions and all this sort of stuff, and that this reason was something that was disclosed to them and gave them a set of absolutely universal principles for the organization of society and of every other aspect of life. And they took this to be universal, but in fact, many of the ideas that they were putting forward were not universal. They were culturally particular. And that, might have been harmless, except that the Enlightenment was also used to justify a whole series of practices that in retrospect seem quite oppressive, right? So that Enlightenment ideas were seen as being complicit in colonialism, in slavery, in racism, and so forth. So for example, there was a line of justification for colonialism that stemmed quite directly from the Enlightenment conception of rationality, whereby it was a kind of patronizing view that said that certain societies are still in their infancy, and so they're not ready, their reason has not yet flourished, and therefore they have to be ruled, from Europe and so forth, right? So, in other words, the Enlightenment was seen as largely an ideology in the Marxist sense of the term, right? That is, it was a set of false beliefs that justified an essentially exploitative set of practices. So that was what people thought the Enlightenment was like, and so as you mentioned, I studied with Habermas. Habermas was often just criticized for being a believer in the Enlightenment or in rational universalism or something like that. And that was seen to be just sort of automatically a term of condemnation. So the climate of opinion has been changing. And there are a number of factors which have been driving that, but the pendulum is definitely swinging back in the direction of reason, partly because, well, so there's this old saying, that the best way to cure people of religion is to give them religion. Well, similarly, the best way to cure people of anti-rationalism is to give them anti-rationalism, and then people start rethinking the attractions of rationality. So something like that has happened. The pendulum has been swinging back. I think it might be swinging back a little bit too far, and so I think Steven Pinker's book is an example of it swinging back a little bit too far. So I'm going to talk in the second half of my remarks about where I think where a reasonable place would be to wind up with on the overall question of Enlightenment reason. But I want to mention a few of the factors that have been pushing the pendulum back in the direction of making people more sympathetic towards the Enlightenment and its ideals. And it's not just the Trump administration. So I think one of the major factors, and I've heard this from people in all corners of the academy, is actually climate change has had a serious impact on the way in which those of us in the humanities, for example, are thinking about our relationship to science, right? And so in my own field of philosophy, but in the humanities more generally, we've spent a lot of time criticizing and disparaging science. And so I was trained in the tradition of critical theory, of Frankfurt School critical theory, a lot of which was organized around a critique of something called scientism. right? And scientism was this idea that the specifically scientific form of rationality could be applied, sort of outside its proper domain to all kinds of different problems, right? And so the tendency to see everything as a scientific problem was seen as again, a kind of an oppressive ideology that we had to sort of shake off, right? And so that it was an important part of the critical project to show the relativity of scientific truth. So, I mean, like I said, people in the liberal arts humanities have spent a lot of the past 5 decades disparaging, undermining, and relativizing the claims of science. Not just on the grounds that scientists are engaging in a kind of overreach, but on the grounds that they really misunderstand even their own project. They don't see the cultural situatedness of science and so forth. Right, so now, so we've been bad-mouthing science basically for 50 years, and now all of a sudden along comes climate change, right? So the IPCC report comes out 2 days ago, and there's this dire report about what's going to happen in the next 40 years if we don't do anything about climate change, put together entirely by scientists. And if you think about the problem of climate change, the only access that we have to it is via science, right? I mean, so we see weather, but we don't see climate, right? Again, it's an important distinction that scientists always have to make, right? That in order to see what's happening to climate, you have to ignore the short-term fluctuations of weather. You have to look at long-term trends, right? And that means you have to collect data. Right? And then you have to analyze that data. This is a classic example of the scientific process at work, right? But that's what gives us access to these predictions about what we're doing. And so we simply wouldn't know about the problem of climate change unless scientists were telling us about it. And we also would not know what to do about it either, right? Figuring out what the appropriate policy response is to climate change is also an extraordinarily difficult problem that we rely crucially upon scientists. And then, of course, we have the entire problem of climate change denialism and the people who want to do nothing about it. And, most people on the left are tempted to bludgeon them on the head by saying, but 99% of scientists agree, right, that climate change is real. Right? Oh, really? Well, since when was the left so enamored of science, right, that you could just appeal to the authority of science, right, as a way of dismissing these views? So I think climate change has caused a lot of people to rethink the overall trajectory, right, and the tenor of the way in which science has been treated in the humanities. So I want to give an example of this, though, like a concrete example of like how like the old line that we've been using about science just sort of doesn't really work very well in the age of climate change. So I teach a course on climate change, and I'm writing a book on it, and so I've been reading up on it. So I was kind of amused, and I was reading the Oxford Handbook on Climate Change and Society. There's like a handbook on everything. You may have noticed. So this is the Handbook of Climate Change and Society. So I was reading about one, Timothy Luke, who I don't want to pick on, but it's kind of an extraordinary article. And who teaches at the College of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences at Virginia Tech. And he had an entry called Environmentality. And so what he's taking his point of departure from here is Foucault, and Foucault's work on governmentality. And so he's trying to expand this Foucauldian notion of governmentality to give this concept of environmentality. And it kind of goes totally off the rails. So I just want to give you some examples of like what he's doing. Because what he's doing in the article is like the standard kind of critical theory move, right? Except that in this case, he's running it against climate science, right? Instead of running it against the kind of bad science that we've spent the last 50 years criticizing. So here's how he kind of goes. He starts out by saying, many evolving combinations of ecological research, technical governance, green entrepreneurialism, and futurological prediction are now a power knowledge formation, right? So this is kind of classic Foucault stuff, right? It's a way of relativizing knowledge by saying, well, we have this knowledge that people like to think of as kind of pristine and, like floating above everything that, we've just discovered it rationally, right? But if you look at this knowledge more carefully, you'll see that it's always connected into configurations of power in society, right? That it always has an institutional dimension to it, right? And then many ways, so that observing that bodies of knowledge bear this connection to social power is a way of typically casting aspersions then upon that body of knowledge, right? And so the power knowledge complex is the idea that systems of power require bodies of knowledge, and bodies of knowledge also require systems of power to sustain them, right? And so in these power knowledge complexes, the power that feeds the need for more knowledge, and then that knowledge generates increased power, right? So all of this is like, in Foucault, is done in a kind of sort of woo-woo, like this is bad language, right? Although he seldom sort of says exactly why it's bad, right? But it's sort of like The understanding is as bad, right? See, but so you get like you get more explicit versions of it. So Luke here goes on then to criticize what he calls green globalism, which is this emergent regime of power. And so he quotes with approval Jean-François Lyotard, remember we were at the postmodern condition. He claims that, quote, scientists, technicians, and instruments are purchased not to find truth, but to augment power, right? So there's the skepticism, right? So you think it's about truth, but really it's about power. So then he goes on to say, well, this is true of climate science as well. He says, climatology is not a closed and certain system of discovery, and it is being challenged from many sides. Like any science, its theory and practice represent a will to knowledge that is anonymous, polymorphous, susceptible to regular transformations and determined by the play of identifiable dependencies. All right, so, okay. So like, but where's he going with this, right? So now so he's like this Foucaultian, but now he's sounding like a right-wing climate denialist, right? And he's calling climate science futurological prediction, right? Which is a nexus of power and so forth. So then he actually draws that conclusion. He says, a new regime of power is emerging. He says, by leveraging greenhouse gas reduction as the cause of action, a tremendous range of new interventions of the conduct of everyday life have been made immediately more legitimate, more imperative, more thorough. Thus, the green movement's relentless policing of everyday life, what light bulbs to buy, what food to eat, what clothes to wear, how to commute, what sort of shelter to inhabit, and so forth, represents yet another proliferation of governance theories and practices beyond the political as such. And then he goes on to talk about various like sites and opportunities of resistance to this green globalism and right? Okay, so I quote for this to sort of show like how, I mean, the article kind of goes completely off the rails. That is, he's not self-consciously being a right-wing climate denialist. He's just a good Foucaultian doing the critical theory that he was taught to do in graduate school, right? Which is when you see some body of knowledge, you immediately look at the power functions that it serves. And then you cast aspersions on it by saying, oh, look, it's generating a new regime of power, right? Well, you know, like carbon taxes could look like a regime of power, right? There's lots of people who say, oh yeah, the government wants carbon taxes because they don't want you to have your car. They're trying to take away your car and this kind of thing, right? It's just a regime of power. So you get this kind of weird blend, right? Where the classic critical theory line is actually, in this case, generating the wrong political conclusions. So what you can see is that underlying a lot of that postmodernism and Foucaultian critical theory and so forth, there was actually just a kind of tacit left-wing consensus, right? That we have this big apparatus of critical theory, and we're going to use it to criticize bad guys, right? And we all know who the bad guys are, right? But the theory itself was never able to actually distinguish the good guys from the bad guys. So here's an example then of a person who kind of goes off the rails and starts using it to attack the good guys, right? In terms of how the argument functions, it's indistinguishable, right? So what it shows was that, I mean, and that's actually the reason why a lot of people now are starting to question that apparatus, right? Because that apparatus was kind of an all-purpose mechanism for just undermining any claim that anybody's trying to make, right? In other words, it was a kind of a skepticism. So he goes off the rails in, I think, a really sort of useful and instructive way. And what it reveals was that in the background, like the critical theory was never doing that much work, right? It was the kind of left-wing consensus amongst university professors that was doing all the work. All right, so I think a lot of people that have been rethinking this stuff, because now there's a body of science that people like, right? And people want to take it seriously. And it obviously has, I mean, he's not wrong that climate science is a power knowledge configuration, right? What is it that funds climate research? It's the fact that people intend to do something with it, right? In other words, it has institutional consequences. Like we want to act in the face of climate change. And the actions that we want to undertake to combat climate change are coercive, right? There's no question that we want governments to force people to stop doing various things that they've been doing. A carbon tax is coercive, right? So it's clearly there's a social power formation which is driving the production of knowledge. And that production of knowledge is in turn feeding back into the social power formation. And yet, in this case, we don't regard this as being a scary, spooky thing. We regard this as like a totally appropriate response to the environmental problems that we're confronting. Right? So you have this apparatus that really can't tell the difference between good versions of power knowledge and bad versions of power knowledge. So I think that's made people increasingly dissatisfied with the apparatus. And there's also just the cultural impact of just kind of bad-mouthing science for decades, and then suddenly wanting to turn around and trust scientists. Okay, so that I think is an example of how of the kinds of concerns that have led to a lot of soul searching within the liberal arts and humanities, of people wondering whether or not they were really on the side of the angels in a lot of these debates about science and human knowledge. So, so the pendulum begins to swing, right? So people then start to think, well, maybe we should give the science a second look here. Now, I think the pendulum swings too far in Steven Pinker's work, right? So Steven Pinker published Enlightenment Now. There's been a bunch of Enlightenment books. I'm just one of the many like Enlightenment boys out there. So he published Enlightenment Now, and it's sort of amazingly non-compromising. So it's like basically a 500-page compendium of all of the good things that have happened since the Enlightenment. So it's kind of a sequel to Better Angels of Our Nature, which is specifically about violence. What he does in Enlightenment Now is he takes like a huge range of other dimensions of well-being. So showing that basically, like the Enlightenment has been kind of like progressively improving the human condition, right? So while we in the chattering classes have been, naysaying, the heroes of the book are kind of the scientists and the engineers who've continued to soldier on using the scientific method to try to improve technology, to improve the human condition, to increase our knowledge, and so forth. So the book is kind of like Enlightenment fundamentalism, where he basically says, look, the 17th, 18th century Enlightenment thinkers were basically just right. And that everybody who's been doubting that in the 19th and 20th centuries was basically wrong. And so what we need to do is just acknowledge that they were right and like get with the program and stop complaining about the entire thing. So if you look at, this is like tons of data in the book. There's some beautiful data, but economic growth, reductions in violence, improvements in health, technological progress, and so forth, right? Like all of this like has been continuing. But it hasn't been continuing with the support of the sort of symbolic processing chattering classes, right? It's the scientists and engineers who have been doing all the work. So, I mean, it's like, he's not wrong about any of this stuff. He's not wrong about that. So, I mean, you just take simple things like, dental anesthesia, like that's a great thing. Like, so if you ask someone, like, hypothetically, how would you like to live in, how'd you like to live in the 19th century? You read some 19th century novel, it sounds so wonderful, right? Like, oh, I could be a country parson, I could live in this little thing, it'd be so quaint and whatever. And then someone just has to come along and say, yes, but there was no dental anesthesia, right? And that's like the end of the utopia, right? So, like I remember reading Freud's interpretation of dreams, being amazed at how many people had nightmares about dentistry. Right, so it's like a huge category, right, in the interpretation of dreams. People have these dental dreams. It's just weird. You're reading it, and it's like, it's really foreign. But of course, people had dental dreams, right? Because in like 19th century Vienna, like, dentistry was one of the most traumatic things that people would have undergone by the age of 30 or 40. So it was like a huge feature of life, and technology fixes that, right? And it's not a complicated thing, but it's a matter of progress that we, of course, take for granted. So Pinker's not wrong to remind us of all these massive improvements in quality of life and so on that have occurred because of scientific and technological progress. The problem with it is the idea that there was just the Enlightenment was right, and then a bunch of people kind of got weak-kneed about it and thought it had some problems, and then they were just wrong. He fails to distinguish between. So it's certainly the case that in the late 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, there was a kind of backlash against Enlightenment rationalism, what we think of as Romanticism. Right? So there was an anti-Enlightenment movement that consisted of people basically saying, you're leaving out all of these things with their conception of reason that I have a strong adherence to, and therefore I think emotion's better than reason, or something like that, right? So there's kind of a romantic backlash against the Enlightenment. But Pinker's history doesn't distinguish between that and what happened in the 20th century. Because what happened in the 20th century that generated a lot of this skepticism about the environment was not just a romantic backlash, right? So it wasn't as though people just kind of said, oh, I don't like the Enlightenment, right? There were very, very serious challenges made in the 20th century to the basic theory of mind that underlay the original 17th, 18th century Enlightenment project, right? So like, in other words, it wasn't just a romantic thing. Right? There were genuine discoveries made about the nature of mind, about the nature of human thinking, that appeared to deeply challenge the Enlightenment conception of reason. So my own view is that those need to be taken seriously, And so that, this is leading up to why it's Enlightenment 2.0. That is, you can't just go back and dogmatically reaffirm the original Enlightenment. You need to, reinvent the Enlightenment. And in particular, the concept of reason needs to be saved from a lot of genuine skeptical worries about reason that developed in the 20th century. So I want to talk about the two big ones, and the ones that had the biggest impact in the humanities and in French thought, most obviously. All right, so my own approach to the question starts with like a frank acknowledgement of the really, really powerful critique of reason that developed in the 20th century, right? And an acknowledgement that a lot of that stuff was right, and so you need to kind of develop a more sophisticated theory of reason. You can't just go back to the old one. So look, what's the first one? So the first big one is what's sometimes called, slightly hyperbolically, the discovery of the unconscious. But it's so all that stuff about Freud, I've already mentioned Freud, right? Freud is hugely important. That is that even if people don't accept many of Freud's specific doctrines, Freud drew attention to a phenomenon that people had underestimated in the past, which is the extraordinary extent to which our everyday cognitive activities are unconscious, right? So everyone always kind of knew there was unconscious stuff going on, right? But we dramatically overestimated the computational power, but also just the amount of what goes on in our brain is conscious, right? And so like nowadays in cognitive science, people will compare our conscious mind to like a driver in a car, right? And imagine like a Tesla where you just got a dashboard that kind of every so often gives you information, right? Like, your engine's getting a little hot, stuff like that. Like every so often stuff shows up on the screen that, oh, you might like to know this, right? But like what's going on in the car, you have like no idea. You're just driving the thing. And the car doesn't really need to tell you, like, how does the automatic stability control in your car work, right? Your car judges that you don't really need to know that. It's just that when the automatic stability control gets activated, a little light goes on saying, bing, right? Like, and you're like, oh, wow, great. I'm not going to drive off the road. But you don't need to know how it works, right? So that's the metaphor that a lot of people are using in contemporary cognitive science to think about the relationship between our conscious mind and the unconscious, which is that a huge amount of what our brain is doing is not available to us. And so, Freud is the person that we associate with having impressed that upon people. Freud's a controversial figure because there's been a great deal of criticism of his work, but the basic point is one which is now, I think, universally accepted. So to give you an example, like a totally non-Freudian example of how it's become universally accepted and why it's so important, is to look at actually the history of artificial intelligence research. You didn't have that. At the end of my anarchist phase, I worked as an AI programmer for about 4 years. So I worked on artificial intelligence systems like back in the 80s and 90s, right? And so in the late 80s, well, people were beginning to realize that it wasn't going to be showing up anytime soon. Right? But so one of the astonishing things about artificial intelligence was how optimistic people were about the potential of computers to mimic human intelligence, right? To pass a Turing test or whatever. So in the late 60s and 70s, people thought that artificial intelligence was like right around the corner, right? So any day now we're going to have, we're just be chatting away with like our computers and so forth. So like my favorite example of this is the HAL 9000 computer in 2001: A Space Odyssey, which as Dave is like crawling through the tube trying to get to it, he passes the plate, which shows that the computer was activated in 1992. Right? So, and the movie came out in 1970, right? So people thought that in 22 years, we were going to have computers that were like the HAL 9000. So let me just remind you of a few things that HAL was capable of. HAL was capable of, obviously, fluent speech, speech recognition and natural language processing, facial recognition, lip reading, art appreciation, and also interpreting human emotional behavior. And also HAL could play chess. So there's one thing that computers can do well, and that's play chess. And even, like, I have a Google Home Assistant, and I talk to it, and it's like not a great conversation. So why did people just vastly overestimate what computers were going to be capable of doing? Well, it's because we designed computers. Doug and I were joking about this with the von Neumann architecture. You always have to drop John von Neumann's name. It's like a philosopher's trick. Okay. we design computers to mimic the way our conscious mind functions. And to automate tasks that we find difficult to perform with our conscious mind, right? So like working memory is a huge problem for humans, right? It's why you can't do long multiplication in your head, right? It's because of a memory bottleneck, right? So we freed computers from that bottleneck, and then they became capable of doing computations that we find enormously difficult, right? So what happened is we built computers on the model of our conscious minds, in a sense like a mirror of our rational minds. And then suddenly computers find it incredibly easy to do things that we find incredibly hard. All right? So, you know, adding up huge columns of numbers and all this kind of stuff. Playing chess, right? These are all things we find hard to do. So people thought, well, okay, so it took us like just a couple of years to build computers to do the hard stuff. So now all we have to do is teach them to do the easy stuff. You know, like learning English and walking, right? And telling when someone's being sarcastic, you know, easy stuff like that. Recognizing someone's face that you haven't seen for 10 years, right? Easy, right? Well, it's easy for us to do this kind of stuff, right? But the real error was thinking that because it's easy for us, it's going to be easy for computers. So then when you sit down and you try to figure out how to train a computer to interpret natural language, right, to disentangle syntax, or to recognize a face or whatever, suddenly people realized, well, not suddenly, over time it dawned upon people that this stuff was of staggering computational complexity, right? This stuff was not easy. This stuff was like orders of magnitude more difficult than playing chess, right? Or doing multiplication and stuff like that, right? It's the reason we think it's easy is because our brain does it for us. That is, it's not something we have to explicitly go through. Right? So something like recognizing faces, right? We have evolved or adapted like modules that generate the result. You see somebody, and it's just like the bing goes off on your dashboard. It's like, you know this person, right? We've all had the experience. Then you have to think, how do I know this person, right? But recognizing the person is something that your brain does for you, right? And that's a lucky benefit of having, you know, being the product of millions of years of evolution. Is that we've inherited this brain that's capable of doing all of these phenomenally complex things, which is how our ancestors, going back millions of years, not even human ancestors, but our mammalian ancestors, is how they survived in the environment, right? It's how they predicted trajectories and how they found food and how they recognized individuals they knew and how they identified mates and stuff like that, right? So we've inherited all of these incredibly complex cognitive routines that we think they're easy because they're unconscious. And then we have to figure out how to make computers do it. We have no idea. Like, if I want to teach a computer how to multiply, I know how to do it because I multiply explicitly. But if I want to teach a computer how to tell the difference between male and female faces, I have no idea how to train the computer to do that because I don't even know how I do it, right? Except I do it, like all of us do it, with enormous reliability. All right, so the stuff about AI then is a good example of how the unconscious can't be ignored. Like a huge amount of what's going on in our brains is simply not available to us. So the old Enlightenment view tended to think of reason as being sort of sovereign. And so you had a bunch of this sort of murky, traditional, emotional, intuitive stuff. And that was kind of the opposite of reason. And the basic model of Enlightenment was reason was supposed to just sort of take over for all of this other stuff, right? So that in the past, people might have relied upon their intuitions. But now we're just going to substitute reason for all these other cognitive operations. And that is that's fundamentally undermined, that view of the mind. Because, and again, there's a bunch of other studies that really cleverly show that reason it is layered on top of. So our explicit cognitive competencies require all of these underlying routines that themselves can never be fully rationalized because they're never fully available to consciousness. So we can't just sort of get rid of these other parts of our brain that we inherited from evolution and that are just give us intuitions. We still need to be using those parts of our brain, right? So reason can maybe like do quality control or supervision or something like that, right? But you can't have a model of people whereby we suddenly become like rational the way Spock was rational. Where, you know, like he instantaneously does calculations and says, you know, our probability of surviving Jim is 99.47 or that kind of stuff. It's never going to be the case, right? Our estimations of probability, for example, are always going to rely upon our evolved heuristics. Right? So that's the first point. The point about the unconscious is a huge difference between us and the Enlightenment thinkers of the 18th century. The second then is the linguistic turn, right? Like language. In the 18th century people, in the original Enlightenment, people gave no particular status to language and they didn't see its importance. And so the 20th century again, language became enormously important. So if you had to pick one person then most important in this tradition would be, say, Wittgenstein, although a number of other philosophers contributed to it. But basically what we call the linguistic turn, and the reason we spend so much time talking about language in the humanities, is that the older Enlightenment view subscribe to what we sometimes call a philosophy of consciousness, right? So when we think about our thoughts relate to the world. There's an obvious sort of question about how it is that our thoughts wind up hooking on to the world or relating to it, right? So how is it possible that our thinking is about something in the world? So before you ask the question, is it true or false? Like, is your scientific belief true and so on? You have to have some kind of an implicit understanding then of how our minds even relate to the world in the first place. Right, so it's the content of our mental states that is at issue. And the idea that was dominant in the 17th and 18th century, that probably Descartes is the most important person, is to say, well, when you're trying to understand the contentfulness of thought, you can think of it in some ways as being like a picture, right? So if you ask the question, like, I'm thinking of a tree, and then there are trees out in the world, how does my thought about a tree relate to the actual tree in the world? Well, one model for thinking about it is to say, well, like when you close your eyes, you can picture a tree, right? You've got this mental image, it's like a picture. And the picture is a picture of something, right? Namely the tree. So so thoughts on this way of thinking of things are basically like pictures in your mind, and those pictures relate to the world. Right? So that was the model that was in the 17th and 18th century, was universally accepted as the correct way of thinking about the relationship between mind and the world. Now look, there are always lots of problems with that view. So like Descartes even had and Locke had this famous one about, you're thinking of a spotted chicken, and so, so that means you have a picture in your mind of the spotted chicken. Okay, how many spots does it have? And then people are like, I don't know. Like, I was just thinking about a spotted chicken. It doesn't have any specific. And then people say, oh, well, how could you have a picture in your mind if you can't count the spots? Go ahead, count the spots, right? Anyhow, so like this is like an old problem with the view. So there was an accumulation of difficulties with this view, whereby people, and a lot of our thoughts, like the sentence that I just spoke, don't seem to correspond to any obvious picture, right? Because I'm speaking in highly abstract vocabulary and I'm using lots of words that don't seem to have anything to do with the world and so on. So that picture theory was always problematic, but that was the dominant model. And what was crucial about that model is that it was completely individualistic. What it meant was that you, as a solitary being, could look out onto the world and you could form thoughts about the world. The same way you could open your eyes and see the world, you can also form thoughts about the world, right? And then you could reason about those thoughts, and you could make predictions, and you could develop a science, and you could do all of this completely by yourself. So what was reason on this picture of things? Reason was a structure of consciousness that you had, right? It was like a way of thinking about the world. But it was entirely private. So that's what gets criticized so profoundly in the 20th century, right? Because pictures have a kind of relationship to the world. But there's another thing that has a relationship to the world, and namely that's language. In other words, when we speak, right, our sentences all pick out objects in the world. They relate to the world in a way that seems to be quite similar to the way in which our thoughts relate to the world. So the older 18th century view had no real place for language. Language was thought of as just a kind of a code, right? So I, like Robinson Crusoe, I could form my thoughts about the world, and then I could develop a whole system of beliefs. And then, there'd be other people around. And then one day I might get lonely and decide to share my beliefs with someone. And so I'll turn them into like language, which is like, it's like using flags or something to signal. I just got to give it some words, and then I'll just communicate my thought to you, right? And then if you're lucky, you'll grasp and you'll share the picture that I had or something like that, right? So that's what we call a code theory of language. Now, there was an accumulation of difficulties with that view of language as well. Right? So what we call the linguistic turn was a kind of dramatic reversal in the way in which we characterized thought. So instead of taking thought on the model of a picture of the world, the suggestion was made that we instead treat the sentence and the relationship that meaningful sentences have to the world as the primary model for thinking about the way in which our minds relate to the world. Right? So the question of aboutness then gets transferred over to the question of how language becomes meaningful. Right? So that's why in the 20th century, philosophers in particular spent so long talking about language, because they began to think that language, in fact, provided the key to understanding the way our minds relate to the world. Right? Like, it's not an accident that I'm speaking to you right now and that I'm at the same time thinking, right? What thoughts am I thinking? They're just the sentences that I'm producing, right? Like, you have you have direct access to my thoughts because I'm speaking them right in front of you, right? So, right, language becomes seen as the vehicle of thought. So it's not just a code that we use to communicate signals to one another, right? It's the actual medium in which we do our thinking. Right? So that's also a dramatically different way of thinking than about reason. Because what is reason then? Reason is not something built into my brain. Reason is going to be embedded in the set of practices that constitute our language. Right? All right. So both of these, these are the two big things that happened in my little neck of the woods in the 20th century: the unconscious and Freud, and then the linguistic turn in Wittgenstein, that completely changes the way we think about mind and its relationship to nature. So you can't then, so you can't just kind of go back to the 18th century view without saying something about these two decentrations, right? Now, I should mention that both of those discoveries and changes in the way we think can easily be used to draw skeptical implications, right? So the unconscious stuff is like, there's lots of skeptical problems you can get out of that. Because then, because the unconscious is doing all this stuff, right? So how do you know, right? You think you're being so rational. How do you know, right? Because you don't know most of what's going on in your brain. So maybe it's just confabulation and so on, right? So, think of the dominant trend in psychology in the second half of the 20th century was to show, and ongoing, right, was to show that people think they're making all these rational decisions. But in fact, it's totally unconscious factors that are driving it all, right? Like judges sentence people to longer prison terms before lunch than after lunch, right? Because they're hungry, right? And so it's actually they're hungry. And so they wind up sending people to prison for longer. I mean, it's like the bread and butter kind of 20th century psychology experiment, designed to show you're way less rational than you think you are because your unconscious is doing all this sneaky stuff that you don't know about. Right? So that's the number one. And then with respect to language, I mean, one of the things that's obvious about language is that people speak totally different languages. Right? And so if the way in which we reason is using the medium of language, then doesn't that imply that reason is going to be specific to culture and to language, right? So isn't it the case then that people are going to reason differently if they're speaking different languages? So again, it appears to immediately generate relativistic consequences. So there's a reason why in the 20th century something like that Foucauldian critical project struck people as being so persuasive, right? Because these two big discoveries actually raised really significant doubts about the autonomy of reason and the independence of reason from the social. All right, so I think that has to be contended with, and that's actually why I have the 2.0 on the Enlightenment thing, which, by the way, I'm going to end with a slight apology for. I actually have a friend who works in Silicon Valley, and he's totally plugged in with all the technical stuff, and he always reads my books before I publish them. So I sent this to him, and I immediately got back this huge groan, oh my God, you can't possibly call a book Enlightenment 2.0, because he's Web 2.0 was so 1997. He says we're at Web 11.0 now. This was in 2013. Anyhow, he thought it was a desperate attempt by an aging academic to sound relevant, and I was totally flubbing it because the kids all know that we're way past Web 2.0. So I had to explain and apologize slightly that no, the reason I did the 2.0 thing was I know we're on 11.0. I didn't know that, but I know we're past 2.0. But there was a specific change from Web 1.0 to 2.0 that I think was really significant, which is what I wanted to draw upon. So Web 1.0 many of you will remember, was back when the internet was really small, and people thought that you could classify it like a library. And so the way in which Yahoo and Alta Vista, these old search sites worked, right, was that they hired people to catalog all of the websites. The same way librarians take all the books and they record and they give them codes and they slot them in. So people's job was to read the entire web and then classify things. So when you wanted to find something, you would start by identifying the general topic you were interested in, and then you'd pick a subtopic, and then you keep on going down until eventually then it would link you to the site, right? So that obviously became difficult to keep up with as the web got larger and larger. So Web 1.0 got overwhelmed by the growth of the internet. So Web 2.0 was Google and stuff like that, right? Where they came along and said, instead of hiring people to classify, look at what people themselves are doing on the web. They're linking to each other. You can use the user's own behavior as a way of figuring out what's the more relevant search result. Right? So the big transition was going from what I think of as the classic rationalist model, whereby a single person sits down and classifies and organizes it. It's like Diderot's encyclopedia, right? To this idea that instead of one person doing the whole thing, we're gonna look at a socially decentralized system, and we're gonna rely upon that as a way of classifying it, right? So that's actually the shift that I wanted to flag with the Enlightenment 2.0, is that whatever conception of reason one's gonna have, it's gonna have to be social, for example. Right? So the idea of, like, in the lowliness of the soul, you peer out onto the world and you grasp the truth, is not a plausible model of how human reason functions. Right? So human reason has to be social, right? And it also has to take account of the limitations of our human intellect, right? So the Foucaultian thing comes from thinking that as soon as you realize, so there's this connection to the social, right? Which Foucault's right about. Like, you have knowledge, it's going to be connected with power and with social institutions and so on, right? But the mere fact that it's connected to the social doesn't mean it gets reduced to, like, just power, right? So there's a kind of overreaction to thinking that as soon as it gets outside the purity of your mind, goes into the social, that everything's just contaminated, right? So it's nothing but like a free flow of power and oppression. That's kind of giving up too quickly. So what I try to do in the book then is to present this more modest conception of the Enlightenment, vis-a-vis Pinker, which is going to take on board the obvious limitations of individual human rationality, coming from the unconscious, coming from the social dimension, right? But will nevertheless preserve the idea that the major factor which has been driving sort of human progress and the improvement of the human condition is the achievements of rationality, right? I mean, that's what's central to the quality of life and to the individual freedoms that we enjoy, right? So we want to preserve and protect that without denying the obvious challenges to that model that were presented in the 20th century. So thank you very much.
You don't end the book on a very hopeful note. You're kind of pessimistic about where things are going. Do you now, 4 years later, do you have any more optimism?
Well, so I mean, the thing that I thought was kind of like, I was hoping many people would like rally to the banner, right? So part of having a social conception of rationality then is realizing that there can be a progressive politics of rationality, in the sense that what it means is that you can't just be rational all by yourself. And so one of the ways in which I negatively characterize the sort of old Enlightenment types is that they always have these big criticisms of everything, all this irrationalism. And then when it comes time to, like, okay, wise guy, what's your plan, right? Like, how are you going to fix it? What they wind up saying is some variation on just think harder, right? So there's all this irrationalism. So we all just have to kind of double down and think harder. Or we need, like, more education, right? So we need, like, more critical thinking classes. Which weirdly, like, if you study critical thinking classes, they're actually pretty modest in their ability to improve people's critical thinking, for a variety of reasons. So a lot of the old remedy is just like, you as an individual just have to be more rational, and we have to try to make your students more rational. So what I try to suggest then is if you take seriously the social dimensions of rationality, realize that you can't be rational all by yourself, right? That there's a set of practices that support rationality. What that means then is that we can also imagine the possibility of a politics where we try to create those social conditions, all right, where we identify also forms of behavior that are undermining those conditions. Right? So that in general is an optimistic approach in the sense that it opens up the possibility of a completely different avenue for advancing the Enlightenment project. Right? So what we've been hearing since the 18th century is just the same old like think harder, right, as the only way of advancing the Enlightenment project. And so I thought I was being kind of optimistic at an abstract level by saying, no, look, there's a whole range of strategies that could be employed to advance the project that really haven't been taken seriously enough, right? But, you know, like, in terms of like specific interventions that could improve it then, that's not my strong suit. So I was kind of hoping to sort of inspire people to think about it. And that sounds lame, but like, I mean, I mentioned the book though, like I'm really inspired by people in design, for example. Right? So when people like Bruce Mao and so on, who are thinking broadly about design as about how human cognition with all of its, you know, defects and limitations, how it interfaces with tools, right? And he's been generalizing that to think beyond just tools and interfaces, but also institutions, right? Like how to think about a school from a design perspective and so on. That's exactly the kind of thinking I think is right? But like he's a genius at this stuff and I'm not, right? So I was trying to just kind of give philosophical cover though to what I think could be a much broader way of thinking about the possibility of creating cognitive environments that actually make us more rational rather than undermining our rationality.
Thanks. I want to go back to the start of your talk. What thing I was most fascinated by was your analysis of how the work was being done by the politics of the faculty rather than by Foucault, and by that kind of apparatus that we could use. And that climate change had caused us to reevaluate that, those of us who are lefty faculty, humanities types. And I'm wondering if we're doing the same thing with science now, whether that move is also opportunistic and not doing the real work. And what I'm thinking of is the sort of well-documented fact that typical lefty faculty, like most of us here, are ardent supporters of climate change as a reality, but when you ask us about genetic modification, we're suddenly anti-science. So is our use of science here actually a return to Enlightenment values, or is it just pure politics all the way down?
Right. Yeah, so I mean, I was trying to find some way to work that in just to kind of annoy people, but thanks for doing it.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I mean, this is kind of, you know, it's a kind of a easy way to score points on people, is that if you look at the scientific consensus about the safety of GMO foods, it's as overwhelming as the scientific consensus that climate change is real and happening. And also safety of vaccines and stuff like that, right? And so a lot of people have inconsistent views. Now I take that to be like a hangover from, that is a kind of, like the need for a new attitude towards science is still semi-digested on the left. That is, a lot of people still have a lot of traditional views, right? So, I mean, there's still huge suspicion of technology. I mean, so I don't want to get into it because I don't want to be too unpopular, but like organic food is something that really bugs me, because it's not an environmental movement, it's an anti-technology movement, right? So if you look at, I mean, so people buy organic, they think that it doesn't have any pesticides or herbicides on it, right? But organic does not prohibit the use of pesticides and herbicides. It prohibits the use of synthetic pesticides and herbicides, right? Well, there are a lot of incredibly dangerous banned herbicides and pesticides like arsenic that are entirely natural, right? But in particular, the thing that's most pernicious about organic is banning the use of synthetic fertilizer, which really doesn't make any sense, right? So, I mean, some of the pesticides, you can kind of understand it, right? But like, you know, why you can't take nitrogen from the air, right, and fix it and then put it into the soil directly, like humans can't do that, but plants, it's okay if they do it. Like, it just doesn't make any sense, right? So it's an anti-technology movement. that's masquerading as a lot of other different kinds of things, right? And it intersects in some ways with a couple other concerns people have, but fundamentally it's an anti-technology movement. So I would love there to be like a food labeling thing that was just pure environmental, right? Just environmental label, none of this other crap about technology, right? So I think there's a lot of like, so if you look at people's attitudes towards GMOs, if you look at people's attitudes towards organic and so on, right? That they actually are a bit of an inheritance from the 1960s, and the kind of anti-rationalism and anti-science that was the sort of bread and butter of my parents' generation. And climate change then is hugely anomalous in people's belief systems, right? Because they have all these anti-science, anti-technology views, but then climate science is like this anomaly. And it's incredibly difficult to reconcile the scientists must be right view on climate with scientists must be wrong about GMOs. So that's why I mean it's semi-digested. I don't want to push the food metaphor. I'm smelling the food or something. It's not talking about food. But I think that's why climate change is so important, though, because that's the wedge that's really causing a lot of people to reconsider a lot of these traditional political views that they have. Oh, in the back, there's a...
Thank you for your talk. Great talk. I'm going to give this a go. I'm not quite clear what my question is, but so in our context as educators, so I'm really fascinated, personally as an educator, I'm very fascinated in the whole question of the unconscious cognition and conscious cognition, and what we do with that as educators.
Yeah.
Especially us in the liberal arts and sciences, a lot of what we are here to do every day is try to make some impact through some kind of conscious cognitive work on the unconscious cognition of our students. Hopefully in the quest for, enlightenment, and to create some kind of enlightenment that is going to be a force for good in the world. So I think what my question is, I'm sort of thinking about high school French. So most of us learned high school French in a particular kind of, this is conscious cognition that we're doing with you. We're teaching you the rules of French. And we sort of came out of high school French as sort of a really bad form of AI. We were like these, AI persons who could understand all the rules and do all the rules and pass all the rules tests, but couldn't have a conversation in French. And so then in the 80s, those of us in language education moved towards the natural approach, which was just immerse people. Just don't teach them any rules at all. Just let them be there, and their unconscious minds will do the work. And we realized that, yeah, you know what? People can now have a conversation in French, but it's broken and there's no correct syntax. So then we moved to the next stage in our enlightenment in how to teach something like language, which was to do both. So teach them the rules, do the conscious cognitive work, but at the same time put them in an immersion and experience and sort of try to do it both things at the same time.
Yeah.
And we had the most positive results from that.
Right.
Not perfect, but getting there.
Yeah.
In terms of actually having some kind of impact on deep learning and sort of transformation in cognition. So my question to you is, in our context, it's that intersect between the two and what we do with that in the classroom. Is it possible for us potentially to move the dial? Do you think it's possible so that we actually have critical thinking classes that work?
Right. So
what is immersion and what is conscious?
Yeah, so that's a fabulous question, and it illustrates the principles really well, which is that, what you think of as the old-fashioned approach to language learning basically is like a rules-based. You teach people grammar, and you teach them all this explicit structure, and then modeled on your own sort of reflective grasp of the language you're speaking, right? So part of the difficulty of getting computers to do natural language processing, right, is the discovery that language learning looks really easy because look at, 2-year-olds are just like learning language like crazy, right? But that's because they have a number of very, very powerful innate heuristics that they're using for language acquisition. So, you know, there's a Chomsky view that says they learn it so well it must be innate. That's probably not right, but probably there are specialized learning heuristics that are specifically aimed at grasping language, right? And that again are evolutionary adaptations. And so kids learn language in a weirdly fast rate. And yeah, so I remember this teaching my kids like baby sign. And it was so obvious they were bootstrapped, like when they were really young, right? It was so obvious that they were bootstrapping off of their, what would eventually be their verbal language skills, right? And that they were just weirdly good at learning that compared to a bunch of other stuff, right? It was totally impossible to teach them. So anyhow, so there is this kind of very kind of formalist approach to things, and then the recognition that no, in fact, there's all this innate stuff in the brain as well that you can't just disregard, and a lot of it's really powerful, so you have to use it, right? So what you're describing as a kind of hybrid approach seems like the kind of exactly the happy medium that I'm sort of recommending more broadly as the relationship between rationality and kind of the rest of our brain and intuition, which is that the two have to work together and harmoniously. But one thing that's really important is the extent to which explicit learning has the capacity to change the way in which our sort of more automatic processes function. So think about language as I was describing it as a language acquisition heuristic. And that's important, which is that it's generic, you can learn any language with it. But then, so you take a portion of the social environment, which is if you grow up and everyone's speaking English, you acquire first language mastery of English, right? Nobody accidentally learns Chinese in an English-speaking environment. So part of the social becomes automatic, right? So now I'm just automatically speaking, thinking in English, right? So there's also significant internalization of the social. But there are a lot of other areas where there's far less significant internalization of the social. Right? So if you think about vision and detection of ballistic trajectories, for example, that appears to be, all of it is innate. And so subsequent learning has very little impact on it. So there's a kind of a neat example of it, which is that we actually have a bug in our intuitive physics system, which is that we anticipate that dropped objects will go straight down, regardless of their forward momentum at the time that they were dropped. So that's why kids, like when they draw airplanes dropping bombs, the bombs are always going straight down instead of like going forward, right? As they do. And everybody makes that mistake. So like when you play like a flight simulator and you have to bomb someone, you always have to correct for the fact that your brain always gives you the wrong answer. And so they've done studies on like, you know, graduating engineering students, and they all get it wrong too, if they're not paying attention. So basically what happens is your brain is like locked into like a buggy way of predicting the way objects are going to behave in the world. And you, when you get taught about this fact about your brain, you can then supervise your brain, right? So in other words, you can recognize circumstances in which your brain is probably giving you the wrong answer, and you can veto it, right? But you can't actually retrain your brain to not give you the wrong answer as the kind of first guess on it. So what happens then is that critical thinking is useful if people are aware of the fact that they may be making a mistake. You've given them really good rules for figuring out what the correct answer is. The problem is that people can't be paying attention all the time. So the reason why, the most robust reason why critical thinking classes don't improve critical thinking is that people, like, they lapse back into a mode of everyday life where they're not expecting to be tricked. And so they stop paying attention. And so, I mean, I think one of the most important things, when you look at studies of cognitive bias and cognitive error, that I constantly have to remind my students and my colleagues and so on, right, is that being smart and educated, having a philosophy degree offers you zero immunity to cognitive bias, right? Like literally zero immunity. But it does mean that once you've been told you're wrong, then education helps you to then find the right answer. Right? And critical thinking allows you to identify what you've done wrong. Right? So people who are highly trained are good at working themselves out of a problem once they realize they're in a problem. But they're no better than the average person on the street when it comes to avoiding the kinds of pitfalls of reasoning that people can fall into. Right? And so that's again why the old Enlightenment model doesn't work. Like, we're not going to become these beings of pure reason who just go through life always thinking rationally, right? Because we don't even have the bandwidth or the capacity to process the information that we're getting. So we're always having to fall back on these intuitive systems, right? We can't be paying attention all the time. And that means we're always vulnerable to making, mistakes, right? So in areas where you can kind of retrain your brain, then that's obviously the correct approach. but there are a lot of areas in which you can't retrain your brain. It's always a bad sign when your answers generate more questions.
Thanks for your talk. I haven't read your book, so maybe you addressed this there, but in your talk today, you talked about how there was this, after the discovery of the unconscious, the linguistic turn, that led to a real reconsideration of the Enlightenment, but what you didn't, I didn't feel you needed to, something that needs to be addressed at least, is the political cataclysm of the 20th century, the 2 world wars, genocides, the Holocaust, and so on and so forth. Now, somebody like Pinker wants to completely divorce those events from the Enlightenment, say they're instances of the counter-Enlightenment, and I have a major disagreement with that. I think that there is a link between the sciences and the potentials that were unleashed by the Enlightenment that take any number of directions, one of which could be Hiroshima or the industrialization of mass death and these sorts of things. And that in of itself leads to a questioning about what was truly unleashed in the Enlightenment. So could you just maybe address that point?
Address that, wow. Yeah, I mean, so that actually sort of gets back more to kind of my roots in Frankfurt School critical theory, because a lot of Frankfurt School arose as a reaction to, so after Auschwitz, no more poetry, right? I mean, the critique of instrumental reason was seen as being the logical conclusion to draw from the experience of the Second World War. So that the problems of Western society were not just capitalism narrowly construed, but the entire model of rationality that underlay it. So, I mean, the political stuff, I mean, I think that, so ultimately I think that's in the end not true. But obviously that's what motivated a lot of the left-wing anti-rationalism of the 20th century. Right? So in other words, historically it was the right that was anti-rationalist. Right? And so so the Enlightenment, the idea that there was always a close conceptual connection between reason and progress. Right? So the thought was, we have all these there's all this unnecessary suffering in the world that people kind of mindlessly reproduce. And so the way in which we're going to chip away at all this unnecessary suffering is by reasoning, like thinking harder, right? And then trying out different ways of solving it and checking it. And that's how we're going to make progress, right? So that was the model. Starting from the French Revolution, Edmund Burke and so on and so forth, I mean, there was conservatism was strongly identified with a defense of tradition against reason, right? Against this kind of let's redo everything. So the political valence of reason was right through to the beginning of the 20th century was always kind of, the left was keen on reason and the right was critical of it. And then that flipped around in the 20th century, and it was largely the experience of the Second World War that did that. And so a lot of what the kind of sort of mechanized destruction and the kind of the really disturbing thoroughness with which the Nazis and the death camps itemized the number of pounds of gold fillings that they were extracting and all this kind of stuff, right? I mean, they were using a highly organized bureaucratic rational system to pursue completely inhuman ends. So many people thought that that was an indictment of the Enlightenment conception of rationality. But I mean, so politically the way that played out though was that people they developed a kind of a blueprint then for left-wing anti-rationalism, which was to say, so here was this bad kind of rationality that gave us the atomic bomb and Auschwitz and so on, right? And so what we need to do is we need to replace it with this other good kind of rationality. There's always kind of blank rationality, right? And so everybody had a different name for it that of the new kind of rationality that was going to give us a new science and a new way of relating to the world that was going to make us immune to all of these temptations, right? And I don't know, I mean, this is not a philosophical argument. It's just that none of those other versions of rationality ever really panned out, right? That is that decades went by and people sort of had nothing to show for these conceptions of rationality. First of all, there's about 20 or 30 of them in circulation. And nobody was ever able to articulate what they did, how they worked. No one was ever able to develop any body of knowledge or science that relied upon those conceptions of rationality and so forth, right? So a lot of the rethinking then of reason, I think, came from the fact that all of these alternatives just didn't pan out and were not in any way demonstrably better. So I think that's I think in part what's led to I mean, so in my own case, like in the kind of philosophical corner of the world, that's what's led people then to reconsider these older conceptions of rationality. But I don't think that's what's driving the broader currents. That's why I gave the example of climate change, because I think that's the kind of thing that's driving the broader current, right? Because climate science is like the most old-fashioned kind of science possible, right? So then if you want to, like, believe in climate science, you then have to have a story about why this old-fashioned kind of science is right, you know, as opposed to its critics.
Thank you. So with regards to the original Enlightenment, it's often attributed to geopolitical constraints. For example, deep seafaring ships were needed to open new trade routes, so people needed to study navigation, to study the stars, and they discovered that we are not the center of the universe, and then those ships discovered successful civilizations that had never heard of Western monotheism, and so this shattered the dogmas that were used to keep society in order. And so in the style of Isaac Asimov's Foundation, the original Enlightenment was not done because people thought, oh, this would be cool, but because it was the only choice they had in order to continue existing as a society. So is there something that is happening or has happened that created the constraints existing in modern times that actually force the need for a second Enlightenment? And it's tempting to say, well, the atrocities of the 20th century, but is it that simple, or is there something else going on?
Yeah, well, I guess, so, I mean, I didn't give a fully satisfactory answer to the atrocities of the 20th century. I have to say that I'm more inclined to blame those on on anti-rational and anti-rationalism. And I think like studying cognitive bias, so for example, like the way like in-group, out-group biases work, right? And the way that generates xenophobia. Like that research, and that's all like intuitive stuff, right? So that's not your rational brain, right? But you have a kind of intuitive like coalition formation mechanism that distinguishes in-group, out-group, that is at work in a lot of these systems of xenophobia, demonization of the enemy, and this kind of stuff, right? That's all non-rational stuff, right? Like that's your evolved mammalian brain that's giving you those things. And so learning what those temptations, like what those tendencies are, and then learning not to trust them, and when they can be triggered and activated and so on, helps us to, I think, combat some of the tendencies that gave rise to, say, the wars and the xenophobia, the racism, so on of the 20th century. But as far as like what drove the Enlightenment, I mean, so I'm of the view, I mean, this is a kind of fascinating discussion in the history of ideas about, you know, what drove the development of all these ideas in the West. I mean, my own view is that it was a crisis of skepticism within the Christian worldview. Namely that, you know, there had been a kind of received view within the civilization for the way in which you went about, you know, answering scientific questions, political questions, moral questions, personal questions, right? There was a framework, right? And that framework, like, suffered a whole series of crises. I mean, the Copernican revolution, I mean, you know, the scientific revolution in many ways, right? Universal gravity, the unification of like the heavens and earthly motion and so on, right? All of this was generated a series of crises for Christianity that left people like with no framework then for thinking about a lot of classic questions. I mean, my own discipline of moral and political philosophy, there's clearly like a crisis there. Right, which is that the idea of a Christian commonwealth had provided the template for thinking about politics for over 1,000 years. And then that model gets completely discredited in several dimensions, right? So then the question is, wow, how do we think about politics, right? Like we just have to come up with something new, right? So I think a lot of Enlightenment thinking was a reaction to a breakdown in the prior mode of thinking. So that's like what drives it, right? So that's why I think that, I mean, if I were to be optimistic then, I mean, what I was describing in the 20th century were also a series of skeptical challenges, right? The unconscious, the linguistic turn, right? Those are skeptical challenges as well, right? So being optimistic, I would say that the chances then of constituting like a new Enlightenment also involve like responding to those skeptical challenges. But that's like, so I'm not as inclined as you were suggesting to attribute it to kind of material conditions. I'm more inclined to think of it. I mean, I take ideas seriously. So I think you can have like a crisis in a worldview that is not necessarily related to trade patterns or anything like that, right? But it just has to do with how people are trying to make sense of the world. And the way in which you've traditionally been making sense of the world can actually stop making sense. And then that forces you to think of new ways of approaching it.
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you.
So I'm just going to make a few announcements about tomorrow before we go. But before Joseph goes, we have a little something to take away. This is a gift certificate for the Humber Room because we want him to come back. Not just to talk in front of us, but to actually come back to Humber. So this is a way to bring him back. So before we go, don't want to hold you for the meals. Just wanted some quick reminders for tomorrow. So we are reassembling back here at 8:30 a.m. for breakfast. And then the panels and sessions will start at 9:30, and they're all going to be in the B building. Few quick changes just for session 1 on arts, music, and the Enlightenment. That'll be now moderated by Carla, who's sitting over there. There's a few speakers that had to back out for personal reason. If you want to make a note, the session 3 on culture and the Enlightenment. Dan Rowe cannot speak in that session. And the only other one is the 11:10 to 12:40 p.m. session. Goran Matic cannot make it. Okay, everything else is the way it is. So tomorrow we will also have lunch and an après reception in the Humber Room. And in terms of food, while we're on that topic, I wanted to make sure that the food at this conference honors Jeff in some way. So I spoke to his wife and I said, tell me his background. And she said, well, it's Irish, it's English, and it's Hungarian. So the food you're going to be served today is going to be English and Irish. The food you're going to be served tomorrow is English, Irish, and Hungarian. And to finish it off, just a few thank yous. So I wanted to thank the whole LAS conference committee for helping me put this together. They are amazing, and we are amazing together. So I wanted to also thank our new acting dean, Vera Belitsan, Don Macaulay, our associate dean, Adriana DeLocua, our acting business manager, Arl Viaggi, our schedule and LAS conference website sustainer, Chris Whitaker, our president, Lori Raincourt, our senior VP academic, Eileen DeCourcy, our associate VP academic. And then for the food, I'd like to thank Janet for helping organize this from Chartwells, and Tamora Antonia will be helping us in the Humber Room. And lastly, you will see in the back there, we have our constant supporter of our conference, a sponsor who comes every year. It's Linnea. She's here from Nelson, so she's brought several books. If you would like to consider any of them for your courses, that'll be at the back. So I won't hold you any longer. Enjoy the food. Oh, yes, thank you for that reminder. That's important. So what you received today was obviously your name tag. On the back of your name tag, you will see a drink ticket. Those drink tickets, I know you're going to kill me for this, are for tomorrow. Okay? So tomorrow we will have at the après reception, also in honor of Jeff, I was told he likes scotch. So scotch will be an option tomorrow in the après reception, and you'll have an option of wine, beer, scotch. So that's in the après reception tomorrow. You also have obviously your book that you're taking away, and you have this to know what's going on tomorrow. So without further ado, enjoy the food. If you want to talk to Joseph any further, if you're lucky, he'll be around a bit, hopefully enjoying some of the food. And thank you very much for coming today, and see you all tomorrow.